the one that best preserves culture, but even if we didn't, culture isn't the be-all and end-all. Second, I'm going to argue that our side of the house is the one that best protects minorities, and finally, I'm going to argue that our side of the house is the one that best protects society. So on to my first point, why do we protect culture better? Now, we recognize that culture is important too, at this debate. That's why we want things like museums to exist in the status quo, where you can protect the knowledge of the language even if people don't speak it outside in society. But ultimately, we think that increasing the social-economic status of an oppressed indigenous minority is far more important than preserving some sort of nebulous cultural value. And that's why we stand firmly on the point that we need to improve their social-economic status before we can even begin talking about culture. Because let's think about it. When does a culture get dignity? A culture gets dignity when the people who practice this culture are also respected in society. A culture that is only practiced by people living in slums and shantytowns gains no dignity within society. If you truly care about the dignity of a culture, then make the people who practice this culture dignified by giving them jobs, by putting them into school. And you don't do this by focusing on teaching indigenous languages. You do this by focusing on teaching math and science in the national language of the nation, which is the language we need to communicate in the workplace. So we tell you, even if these languages die, we'd rather these languages die than see them ultimately become degraded. But okay, even if these languages die, why can't they come back to life as long as we preserve some sort of knowledge of them in the museums? We see this already happening in America, where a lot of black people are going back to their African roots and learning about the African tongues of their own nation from which they were taken as slaves in the past, or rather their forefathers were taken as slaves in the past. And this only happens because people have a social-economic place in order to say, I am proud of my culture and I am proud of my race. If we have a group of indigenous minorities who aren't even proud of the color of their own skin, how can we expect them to learn about their own culture in the first place? No thank you. So on the first level, we need to improve people's socio-economic policies before we can improve their culture. Next argument about minorities. Now, Team Korea has been characterizing us as talking about the zero-sum debate. This is not true. We're not saying if you learn an indigenous language, you can't learn English or the national language. What we did say is that it makes it much harder for you to do so because it takes time away from these classes, especially when we consider that these minorities are often the ones most in need for help. Furthermore, we told them that math and science is really hard to teach in indigenous languages because we don't often have the words and the concepts for these words. Their response, okay, we'll make these words. Let's think about this for a moment. Team Korea tells us they stand against all types of cultural imperialism. Now they want the government to make new words in the language against the will of an indigenous minority without consulting them or consulting only a few people who still speak this language because the vast majority of people in this minority don't speak the language, as you would have us believe. We think that is fundamentally wrong. But even if this point were true, let's think about this further. Who are the teachers that are going to teach math and science in schools? Are they going to be people who currently speak the indigenous language? If they are, where did they get their math and science degrees from? Because there are very few people who have these degrees and speak the indigenous language at the same time. So on one level, they'll be bad teachers. Secondly, if you're going to retrain people who speak national languages to speak the indigenous language, then they're going to have a huge problem getting these concepts across in class because it's a secondary acquired language they've learned and not their own native tongue. So when Team Korea can come up and tell us that it's good that people can talk about this with their parents at home, we tell you teachers in school are far more important than parents. That's why we recognize that schools make the difference, not just the parents. A parent who sends the kid to a worse school is likely to have a kid that does worse in a national academic examinations, even if the parent is well educated himself. So on this point, we think fundamentally that Team Singapore takes the argument about socio-economic rights. The next argument Team Korea presented to us was this argument that said, you know what, socio-economic rights aren't that important as long as we have some sort of culture that makes us feel proud of the fact that I belong to the indigenous minority. Let's consider this on a few points. Firstly, as I argued earlier, wait a while, you don't really feel proud of your culture if you're sitting in the street as a beggar waiting for the handout from an individual from the majority culture. That's not when you feel proud of your culture. Tell me why it is.
Will you tell me why it's very offensive that you're saying that poor people aren't proud of their culture, poor people aren't proud of their identity? Tell me why is that?
I'm not saying a poor person is not proud of his culture. What I am saying is that he'll be a lot more proud of his culture if he was able to link socio-economic success to his culture and not necessarily in a way that stands against it. And the rest of society looks at that culture with respect when individuals who belong to that culture are able to achieve better socio-economic positions. So on the level of the individual, on the level of societal perceptions, we tell you this point is not true. But even if individuals are empowered by their culture, I'm going to tell you there's a lot of precedent in law for overriding cultural practices when it can be proven this makes a positive difference to an individual's life. Why? Let's think about something like female genital mutilation for a moment. It's a cultural practice that arguably gives individuals a lot of value when they practice it. But we ban it because we recognize that this objectively impacts the empirical settings that affect the individual's life, like your right to body or your ability to go and get a job. So in the same way, we think it's okay to ban some sort of relative, subjective, cultural practices as long as we can prove that it objectively increases your ability to function within society. And that's what we proved all the way down the line in Team Singapore. So on the point of who protects minorities better, we do, because we want them to get jobs and university educations, not live in some sort of culture where they can't get these things. Next argument about society. And this is where I'm going to bring back my point about enclaving, because we don't think Team Korea have been able to take this point down whatsoever. Earlier in my first speaker speech, we gave you an argument that these minorities are encouraged to enclave by focusing on the main language of their cultures and not the language of the national region. We're not saying that these individuals don't ever pick up the ability to speak the national language, but when they do so, they do it at a far less extent when they actually learned it in their schools. So this encourages the creation of enclaves because they stick to individuals they feel more comfortable around, individuals they can communicate with, the vast minority of individuals in society. So on the point of how to help minorities integrate into wider society, we must stand with Team Singapore. But more importantly, Team Korea have never considered the opportunity cost to the rest of society. Because what Team Korea is doing is basically spending a lot of money to help very few individuals, where the money could be channeled into broad-based educational programs that will help all the individuals in the country where many children can't even get to school in the first place. They've never answered why this specific focus on the individual opportunity cost is worth it, except by saying, the government's oppressed these individuals in the past, we have to help them now. So let's take down this argument right now. First way, in what way did governments oppress indigenous minorities in the past? They didn't do so by focusing, by destroying their cultural practices. They didn't do this by focusing on taking away things like the socio-economic rights. In America, you prevent a black person from getting employment. So if you want to go and help the indigenous minority in the same way in which you hurt them, then focus on socio-economic prospects, not on culture. That's the first level. The second argument we brought up was the argument that you can't punish the next generation for a previous generation's crimes. They said lots of governments are accepting responsibility to pass generations down. Our response, this is not something they should do. To say you can give a kid in primary school less money than a kid of another race is to commit the same sort of crime that your governments have been doing in the past. You stand against discrimination, we stand against reverse discrimination as well. What you are doing is channeling a lot of money to an individual race which is far more than any other race in society gets. We think this is the exact same situation of racism, even if you say that this is somehow atoning for the problems in the past. We've shown you it's not, and we've shown you the current generation shouldn't think. So because we protect culture, and even if we don't protect culture, at least make people proud of their ethnic identity, because we protect minorities, and because we protect society, go with Team Singapore.